A strike beyond imagination, the Iranian airstrike on H-3. The pre-dawn sky over western Iran was as still as death, painted in deep, unforgiving shades of midnight blue. Somewhere along the flight line, the shrill whine of jet turbines began to rise into the desert air like wolves howling in unison before the hunt. It was April 4th, 1981, and 8 Iranian F-4 Phantom IIs stood armed and ready on a remote tarmac. Each aircraft brimmed with fuel, munitions, and the unshakable resolve of the men who would fly them. Their destination lay deep within enemy territory, nearly 1,000 kilometers away, an Iraqi airbase complex near the Jordanian border, known simply as H-3. To strike H-3 was to strike at the heart of Iraq's military ambition. This vast base complex, nestled in the western deserts, was a fortress of steel and sand, housing dozens of Iraq's most advanced warplanes, helicopters, and refueling assets. Its location, far from the front lines of the Iran-Iraq War, had lulled the Iraqi military into a sense of security. Baghdad believed H-3 to be untouchable, immune from Iran's reach, a safe haven for its growing air power. That belief would soon shatter. This wasn't merely a bombing raid, it was a calculated gamble, a feat of precision and daring that would defy conventional warfare doctrines and rewrite what was considered possible in modern air combat. The Iranian pilots had trained in secrecy. They had studied satellite photos, wind charts, fuel calculations, enemy radar patterns, and even regional weather forecasts. Every inch of the mission had been planned with obsessive detail. The Iranian Air Force, still reeling from the purges of the 1979 revolution and the chaos that followed, was a shell of its former self. But these men, many of them veterans of the Shah's era, had not forgotten how to fly, how to think, how to outmaneuver, and most of all, how to fight. Their plan was daring: fly their strike package at ultra-low altitude for hundreds of miles, weaving through enemy terrain, skimming below radar coverage, and using terrain masking to avoid detection. Multiple aerial refueling operations would be necessary, each executed flawlessly in the dark, with tanker aircraft waiting at pre-arranged points over Iran and Syria. Timing would be everything. Coordination, even more so. One misstep, one delay, and the entire mission could unravel. There would be no second chances. If they were caught mid-route, deep inside Iraqi territory, there would be no rescue, no support, no reinforcements, only fire and steel and death. But what Iran lacked in numbers and logistics, it made up for in boldness. The first phase of the mission began before dawn, with the F-4 lifting off into the black void. Alongside them flew supporting aircraft, C-130s for logistics, tankers for mid-air refueling, and a Boeing 707 configured as an airborne command post. Iranian F-14 Tomcats were also scrambled, serving as protective eyes in the sky, ensuring no Iraqi aircraft intercepted the strike team before they reached their target. Their route took them along a deceptive path, skirting Turkish and Syrian airspace to create the illusion that any radar contact was neutral or simply passing traffic. The pilots flew nap of the earth, sometimes just 50 feet above the ground, hugging the desert, threading through mountain passes, risking collision with terrain in their effort to remain invisible. Iraqi radar, designed to spot high-altitude threats from Iran's heartland, failed to register the F-4s sneaking in from the west. As dawn approached, the Iranian formation split. Two groups of strike aircraft targeted different sections of the H-3 complex, coordinating their attack to the second. The objective was clear: destroy as many aircraft on the ground as possible, disable the base's ability to recover, and return home without loss. And when the Iranian F-4s screamed over H-3's runways at treetop height, they brought hell with them. Precision bombing runs devastated parked MiG-21s, MiG-23s, Su-20 bombers, Tu-16 bombers, helicopters, and even radar installations. The Iraqis, stunned and unprepared, barely mounted a defense. Anti-aircraft fire erupted minutes too late, and by then, much of their aerial fleet was already in flames. Dozens of aircraft were left smoldering on the tarmac. Hangars collapsed under the weight of explosive impacts. Fuel depots erupted in towering infernos. It was destruction delivered with surgical precision, an iron-fisted message from a country the world had underestimated. Within minutes, the Iranian pilots turned east and vanished into the sky, slipping back across the border as quickly as they had come. Iraqi forces scrambled jets in pursuit, but it was too late. The damage was done. By the time the sun rose fully above the western desert, the H-3 complex lay crippled. Iran had pulled off the unthinkable, one of the most daring, complex, and successful deep strike operations in the history of air warfare, without losing a single aircraft. The raid stunned military observers around the world. NATO commanders, Soviet strategists, and analysts from every major air force pored over the details in disbelief. How had a battered air force, isolated by sanctions and hobbled by internal purges, managed to coordinate such a flawless assault so deep into enemy territory? How had they outsmarted Soviet-supplied Iraqi defenses, radar systems, and patrols? How had they executed a mission that some believed would require the resources of a superpower? The answer was simple: planning, discipline, courage, and sheer audacity. In the years that followed, the H-3 airstrike became a case study in military academies. It was dissected, analyzed, and even admired by pilots and strategists far removed from the Iran-Iraq conflict. The operation proved a vital truth in warfare: that precision, cunning, and bravery can triumph over numbers and complacency. That even in the darkest moments, a well-executed plan can pierce the armor of a seemingly invincible enemy. For Iran, the strike on H-3 was more than a tactical victory. It was a symbolic one. It announced to the world that the Islamic Republic, though battered and isolated, could still strike back with power and precision. It was their Pearl Harbor, only in reverse. Not a surprise attack that brought shame and setback, but a retaliatory blow that shocked the enemy and turned the tide. This is the story of that moment. A strike beyond imagination. In September 1980, the Middle East was plunged into chaos as Iraqi President Saddam Hussein launched a full-scale invasion of neighboring Iran. Motivated by a mix of territorial ambition, fear of revolutionary Shiite influence spilling over from Iran, and a desire to establish Iraq as the dominant power in the Persian Gulf, Saddam's forces stormed across the border. He believed the time was ripe. Iran had just gone through the seismic upheaval of the 1979 Islamic Revolution, and the once formidable Imperial Iranian army had been gutted by political purges. Senior officers were executed or imprisoned, logistic systems were disrupted, and morale was fractured. The Ayatollah Khomeini's regime was still consolidating power. To Saddam, it looked like the perfect moment to strike. But the quick victory Saddam had envisioned turned into a long and bloody nightmare. The war dragged on into 1981, transforming into one of the longest and costliest conventional conflicts of the 20th century. Iranian resistance was fierce. Young men, many barely out of school, were flooding into recruitment centers to defend the newly founded Islamic Republic. The military, despite being hamstrung by sanctions and internal instability, reorganized itself and began mounting serious counteroffensives. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps and remnants of the Shah's professional military machine fused into a brutal and determined fighting force. Still, Iran faced massive logistical challenges. The Islamic Republic was under severe international isolation. The United States, furious after the 1979 hostage crisis, had cut diplomatic ties and placed Iran under economic sanctions. Most Western nations followed suit. Spare parts for Iran's U.S.-made weapons, especially its fleet of F-4 Phantoms, F-5s, and F-14 Tomcats, were almost impossible to come by. Mechanics cannibalized grounded aircraft to keep a dwindling number of jets airborne. Iran's arms industry was in its infancy, and its ability to produce advanced munitions or repair complex systems was limited at best. On the other side, Iraq was rapidly becoming the darling of the Arab world and a strategic partner to both East and West. France supplied Mirage F-1 fighters and advanced weaponry. The Soviet Union contributed MiGs, tanks, and logistical support. Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait poured billions of dollars into Saddam's war chest. Intelligence, satellite imagery, radar systems, and spare parts flowed freely into Iraq. It was a golden era for the Iraqi Air Force, and Saddam spared no expense in modernizing it. At the heart of this burgeoning air power was the H-3 complex, an elaborate triad of airfields located in the Al-Anbar Desert in western Iraq, near the Jordanian and Syrian borders. These bases were known as H-3 Main, H-3 Northwest, and H-3 Southwest. The complex was crucial for strategic operations. Aircraft could be stationed there far from the range of Iranian retaliatory strikes. Maintenance facilities were extensive, and the site served as a key logistics and storage hub for aircraft received from foreign allies. To the Iraqis, H-3 was more than just an airbase. It was a symbol of invulnerability. Its distance from the front lines and proximity to friendly countries made it a natural haven for their most prized aircraft. Here, Saddam's elite pilots could rest and rearm without fear. It was believed that even the boldest Iranian commander wouldn't dream of flying that deep into enemy territory, especially with their struggling logistics and depleted air fleet. But within the halls of the Iranian Air Force's secret planning rooms, something audacious was brewing. Intelligence reports had suggested that a large number of Iraqi aircraft, including recently delivered Mirage F-1s, Su-20s, and MiG variants, had been relocated to H-3 for protection and maintenance. If those aircraft returned to active duty, they would pose a serious threat to Iranian counteroffensives and strategic assets. Iranian commanders, many of whom had trained under the Shah's U.S.-backed regime and studied Western air combat doctrine, knew this was an opportunity that could not be ignored. An attack on H-3 would send a powerful message, not just to Iraq, but to the world. It would show that Iran, despite being cornered and bleeding, still had claws. Planning began in absolute secrecy. Pilots were hand-picked, aircraft were prepared in hidden hangars, fuel and munitions were rationed and carefully calculated. A long-range airstrike into western Iraq would require more than just bravery. It would demand precision flying, aerial refueling under combat conditions, and the nerve to fly blind into the lion's den. But the Iranians had one advantage: the element of surprise. On April 4th, 1981, as the desert sun began to rise over the Persian Gulf, a squadron of Iranian fighter bombers, escorted by tankers and supported by reconnaissance assets, lifted off from bases deep inside Iran. Their target, H-3. Their mission, to shatter the myth of Iraqi air supremacy and strike a blow that would echo across the region. What followed would be remembered as one of the most daring long-range airstrikes in modern military history, a mission so bold, so precise, and so unexpected that it would stun both friend and foe alike. The untouchable base was about to be touched. The target. Why H-3 mattered. H-3 wasn't just another air base. It was the crown jewel of Iraq's western air defenses, an oasis of strategic depth that Iraq believed was beyond the reach of any Iranian threat. Nestled near the borders of Jordan and Syria, H-3 was not a single base, but a sprawling complex made up of 3 interconnected airfields: H-3 Main, H-3 Northwest, and H-3 Southwest. These installations were fortified with hardened aircraft shelters, long runways, and multiple layers of air defense systems. It served not only as a forward operating base for long-range Iraqi strike aircraft, but also as a hidden reserve for aircraft still undergoing training, maintenance, or awaiting deployment. The Iraqi Air Force had begun consolidating many of its most valuable aerial assets there. By early 1981, H-3 housed a variety of frontline aircraft, including the sleek and deadly French-built Mirage F-1s, Soviet MiG-23s with swing-wing capabilities, Su-20s for ground attack, and the massive Tu-22 bombers capable of carrying devastating payloads over long distances. Some of these aircraft were still in the process of being assembled or undergoing test flights. Iraq was building a formidable air fleet, and H-3 was its deep bunker. To bolster the sense of invincibility, Iraq had allowed Jordanian personnel and Western military advisors, many of them French contractors, to help maintain radar systems and coordinate logistics at the site. They assumed that the sheer distance from Iran, nearly 1,000 kilometers, made the base untouchable. To reach H-3 from Iran would mean flying across hundreds of kilometers of heavily defended Iraqi territory, where radar stations, anti-aircraft artillery, and potential Iraqi fighter patrols could intercept any unauthorized aircraft long before they reached the complex. But the Iranians had other ideas. Despite having their military infrastructure gutted by the post-revolution purges and facing a strangling arms embargo, the Iranian Air Force still had something left that Iraq underestimated: brains, guts, and a burning desire to strike back. Inside the IIAF, now restructured as the Islamic Republic of Iran Air Force, IRIAF, planners began assembling intelligence from every conceivable source. Defectors from the Iraqi Air Force, many of whom were ethnic minorities or political dissidents, brought maps and aircraft data. Iranian reconnaissance missions using F-4 Phantoms risked deep incursions to snap high-altitude imagery. Perhaps most surprisingly, satellite imagery, likely provided discreetly by third-party nations, revealed movement patterns and aircraft density at H-3. They studied everything: the daily flight schedules, refueling patterns, security rotations, even the placement of anti-aircraft units. The IRIAF knew they would only get one shot. A strike on H-3 had to be precise, overwhelming, and successful within minutes. There could be no second wave. But therein lay the biggest challenge. How do you launch a surprise attack on a target over 1,000 kilometers away, twice the combat range of most Iranian jets, without aerial refueling capabilities or a forward operating base? The U.S.-supplied KC-135 tankers were grounded due to parts shortages. Flying low and fast to avoid radar would burn fuel at a higher rate, and turning back halfway meant risking capture or death. The solution? A combination of audacity, deception, and one of the most complex long-range bombing missions of the 20th century. Iran would need to fly its aircraft through Iraqi airspace in a long, looping arc that avoided major radar installations. The strike force would include F-4 Phantom IIs carrying heavy bomb loads, supported by a small team of aerial tankers and backup fighters. Fuel bladders were to be installed in the back seats of the Phantoms to extend their range. Navigation would be done the old-fashioned way, by map, stopwatch, and guts. And if everything went perfectly, they'd hit H-3 before anyone could blink, and be gone before Iraq even knew what had happened. Planning the impossible. In the war-torn skies of 1981, while Iraqi jets soared high on Western and Soviet technology, the Iranian Air Force was quietly rewriting the rulebook of modern air warfare. On paper, Iran should have been grounded, crippled by embargoes, stripped of logistical support, and reeling from a revolution that gutted its military command. But what they lacked in resources, they made up for in raw courage, ingenuity, and a brotherhood forged in fire. The Islamic Republic of Iran Air Force, IRIAF, though fractured by the revolution and the political purges that followed, still retained its most potent asset, its pilots. Many of these men were relics of the Shah's reign, trained in the finest American and European flight schools, skilled in dogfighting, formation flying, and long-range strike tactics. These were pilots who once flew in peacetime air shows and red flag exercises in Nevada. Now, they were flying patched-up jets with no guarantee they'd survive their next sortie. And yet, when the mission to strike H-3 was placed on the table, not one of them blinked. They understood what was being asked. To hit H-3 was to do the impossible. Fly over 1,000 kilometers into Iraqi airspace, twice the distance of any previous deep strike mission, hit not just one, but 3 heavily guarded air bases, and return alive, all without the benefit of modern AWACS support, satellite navigation, or even a reliable command and control infrastructure. It was suicide by any standard Air Force doctrine. But this was not a standard war, and these were not standard men. The mission profile. The core of the strike force would be 8 F-4 Phantom II multi-role fighter bombers, selected from Hamadan Air Base, a location nestled in the Zagros Mountains, far enough from the front to plan in secrecy, yet close enough to act. These Phantoms, once the pride of the Shah's Air Force, were now held together by the love of their crews and whatever spare parts they could scavenge. Still, their twin J-79 engines could push them fast and far, and their bomb bays could carry enough ordnance to level an entire airfield. Supporting them were 4 Boeing 707 tanker aircraft, unglamorous, vulnerable, but vital. They would fly staggered refueling formations, synchronized to the second. Each one carried just enough fuel to top off the strike jets at precise intervals, once near Iranian territory, again deep into the west, and critically on the razor's edge of Iraqi radar coverage. A miscalculation by even a few minutes could mean dry tanks and certain death. To shield the Phantoms, Iranian command devised a web of deception. A fleet of support and escort aircraft would launch decoy missions to the south and east, flying aggressive patterns near Basra and Mosul to draw Iraqi air defenses and MiG interceptors away from the true flight path. It was a high-risk gambit. If even one Iraqi officer realized the ruse, the entire plan could unravel before a single bomb dropped. Altitude was another weapon. The Phantoms would fly nap of the earth, often less than 100 feet off the desert floor, weaving between ridge lines, power lines, and sandstorms. Terrain-following radar, normally used for such missions, was unreliable in several aircraft. That meant the pilots would fly by gut instinct and visual cues alone. At that speed and altitude, any mistake could be fatal. But it also meant they would avoid the Soviet-built radar arrays that dotted Iraq's airspace like a net. The targets themselves were ambitious. H-3 was not one airfield, but a massive triad. H-3 Main, H-3 Northwest, and H-3 Southwest, each separated by kilometers but connected by roads, radar coverage, and overlapping SAM defenses. Iraq had stashed some of its most valuable aircraft there, brand new Mirage F-1 EQs from France, MiG-23BNs from the Soviets, Su-20s, Tu-22 blinder bombers, and even precious IL-76 transports. Most were still undergoing assembly and testing, parked in neat rows on tarmacs, waiting for activation. What made the plan even more daring was the timing. The entire strike had to be choreographed down to the second. Multiple waves would hit different bases simultaneously. Targets had to be confirmed visually. Communications would be limited to prearranged code phrases. The bomb loads, iron bombs, cluster munitions, and rocket pods, had to be enough to disable hardened aircraft shelters, fuel depots, and command posts, but light enough to allow the jets to make the return flight. And there was no safety net, no second wave, no close air support, no rescue teams behind enemy lines. If a pilot went down, he was on his own in the middle of the Iraqi desert, miles from friendly borders and surrounded by hostile troops. The margin for error wasn't just small, it was non-existent. But perhaps what made the mission most terrifying was this: it was all or nothing. Success would deal a humiliating blow to Saddam's Air Force, crippling their ability to launch strategic bombings and demoralizing his Western backers. Failure would mean the loss of Iran's best pilots and aircraft in one fell swoop, possibly even turning the tide of the war. And so the pilots gathered in briefing rooms with dimmed lights and weathered maps. They studied satellite photos, traced fuel calculations with red grease pencils, reviewed enemy SAM zones, and memorized approach headings like scripture. Sleep was rare, jokes were dark, letters were written and sealed. Many wore the same flight gloves they had trained with under the Shah, a silent tribute to a forgotten era, and a reminder that they were still fighting for the soul of their country. At 0400 hours on April 4th, 1981, the engines of 8 Phantoms roared to life under the cover of darkness. Tankers lifted off in prearranged intervals. Decoy flights veered off toward Basra, and with wings heavy and hearts steady, the strike force sliced westward into history. They were flying into the jaws of the enemy, on a mission that had no right to succeed. But they were not flying to survive. They were flying to win the execution, strike on H3. The sun had just begun to peel back the cold cloak of night from the Zagros Mountains when 8 F-4 Phantom IIs thundered into the skies over Hamadan. The date was April 4th, 1981. These were not ordinary sorties. This was a one-way ticket into the heart of enemy territory, an audacious airstrike so deep and unexpected it bordered on suicidal. The mission, to fly over 1,000 kilometers into Iraq and hit a target so heavily guarded by distance and deception that its destruction would tilt the balance of air power in the war. The F-4s flew in tight formation, ghosting just above the sand-strewn plateaus and rocky outcrops of western Iran. Their wings heavy with bombs, each carrying Mark 82 and Mark 84 general-purpose munitions, precision configured for maximum devastation. Every pilot knew that just getting to the target would test the limits of fuel, technology, and endurance. But they were ready. They were warriors. The sky was their battlefield. Behind them, like silent shepherds, 4 Boeing 707 and 747 refueling tankers kept pace. These tankers were the unsung heroes, modified under embargo conditions, using smuggled or reverse-engineered parts, and flown by crews who knew that if they were spotted or shot down, the entire mission would fail. The first mid-air refueling occurred smoothly over Kermanshah province, a nerve-wracking ballet at several hundred miles per hour, no room for error. The second refueling took place just miles from the Iraqi border. It was a calculated risk. If spotted, the Phantoms could be intercepted before they ever saw their target. But luck, and the element of surprise, was on their side. As the tankers turned back, the strike group pushed forward, alone. The Iranian F-4s now flew at treetop height, below the radar sweep of Iraqi SAM sites. Every minute deeper into Iraq brought them closer to either glory or annihilation. The crews said little. Their voices kept low on the comms. Eyes flicked over gauges. Sweat rolled down their backs. Hands gripped controls tightly, aware that even a flicker of warning from ground-based radar could mean death. They entered the Al-Anbar Desert, a barren, windswept expanse where no one expected Iranian jets. The Iraqis believed the western flank was safe, guarded by distance and the illusion of security. Besides, the H3 airbase complex, comprising H3 Main, H3 Northwest, and H3 Southwest, was nestled just a stone's throw from the Jordanian border. It was a resting place for Iraq's crown jewels, Mirage F-1s from France, MiG-23s from the Soviet Union, Su-20, and the prized Tu-22 bombers. Many were still being assembled, fresh from crates. It was a logistical hub, a storage site, and an operational airbase in one. It was also thought to be untouchable. Iraqi and Jordanian radar operators, unfamiliar with Iranian transponder codes, mistook the low-flying F-4 aircraft as Iraqi aircraft returning from patrol. No alarm was raised. No sirens screamed. The base slept. At 1300 hours sharp, the silence shattered. The first wave of Iranian Phantoms screamed overhead and let loose their payloads. Bombs tumbled from underwing pylons like iron rain. The tarmac erupted in fire and steel. Aircraft parked in neat rows were torn apart in seconds. Mirage fuselages ripped like paper, MiGs burst into orange blossoms of flame, and fuel depots detonated in violent chain reactions. The second wave struck with ruthless precision, aimed at control towers, radar domes, and hangars. Iranian pilots, many trained at American bases before the revolution, flew with surgical skill. They picked targets on the fly, adjusting runs mid-burst. Some aircraft strafed with their Vulcan cannons to finish off survivors. Others laid cluster munitions to cripple anything that might take off. Within minutes, the H-3 complex looked like an apocalyptic painting. Wrecked aircraft smoldered on runways, flames leapt skyward from detonated fuel tanks, and personnel scattered in chaos. Iraqi anti-air batteries, caught completely off guard, responded too late and too inaccurately. A few SAMs fired into empty air. No Iranian aircraft were hit. On the ground, confusion reigned. Iraqi officers couldn't understand how jets had appeared from the west. Calls to Baghdad went unanswered for precious minutes. Some even suspected the Jordanians had betrayed them. But the truth was simpler and more brutal. They'd been outthought, outflown, and outgunned. One of the most remarkable feats of the mission was its coordination. The IRIAF had mapped the strike so perfectly that all three H-3 installations were hit within the same 5-minute window. Iraqi air defenses couldn't consolidate or mount a counterattack. There was simply no time. As the final bombs fell and the Phantoms roared away from the inferno behind them, radar signatures showed the damage was done. At least 48 Iraqi aircraft were destroyed or rendered inoperable. Some were obliterated in their hangars. Others exploded while still in crates. Several Tu-22 bombers, critical for long-range strategic missions, were reduced to scrap. Fuel reserves, munitions stockpiles, and ground vehicles were also annihilated. And then the impossible happened. The Phantoms made it back. They turned east, still hugging the earth. Iraqi interceptors were scrambled far too late, and the IRIAF jets avoided known radar pockets and potential hot zones. As they re-entered Iranian airspace, refueling was waiting for them once more. The tankers swooped in like guardian angels, giving the Phantoms just enough juice to coast home. By the time they touched down back at Hamadan, Iranian commanders were already cheering. News spread like wildfire. The H-3 complex had been devastated, crippled in one masterstroke. No Iranian jets lost, no pilots captured. It was a flawless mission against all odds. The H-3 airstrike sent shockwaves through the region. Iraq was humiliated. Jordanian officials scrambled to explain the radar failure. Western military analysts were left stunned, admitting that no one thought the Iranians still had the capability for such precision, depth, or coordination. In response, Iraq moved its remaining aircraft even further west or buried them deeper in hardened shelters, changes that would take months. But the message had been sent. Iran, battered and besieged, still had teeth. And in the age of missiles and megaton bombs, one truth remained unchanged. Air power, wielded with cunning and courage, could still change the course of a war, the fallout, shock and awe. The smoke had barely cleared over the scorched runways of H-3 when word reached Baghdad. Iranian jets had hit the crown jewel of Iraq's western air infrastructure. The disbelief was immediate. Then came the fury. Saddam Hussein, who had ruled with brutal precision and surrounded himself with yes-men and loyalists, was blindsided. The man who had promised his people a swift victory against a divided Iran had now suffered one of the most humiliating defeats of his career, and not at the front lines, but over what he believed was his most secure military redoubt. H-3 was never supposed to be touched. It was thought to be unreachable, hidden in the Iraqi desert like a dragon guarding its hoard. Now it was a charred skeleton of its former self. Within hours of the strike, Saddam convened an emergency meeting with his top military brass. No one walked in confidently. Inside those chambers, the mood was tense, the air heavy with dread. The president was volcanic, his rage uncontainable. He demanded answers. How could 8 jets, unsupported and unaided, slip through radar nets, travel over 2,000 kilometers round trip, and return unscathed? Finger-pointing began immediately. Some blamed the Jordanian observers stationed near H-3 for failing to raise the alarm. Others accused their own radar crews of negligence. A few brave officers dared to suggest that the Iranians might have simply outmaneuvered them tactically. Saddam, unimpressed, responded the only way he knew how, through purges. Several senior Iraqi Air Force officers were arrested that same day. A few disappeared entirely. Rumors spread that at least 2 generals were executed by firing squad for gross incompetence. For Iraq, the implications were devastating. In one fell swoop, it had lost dozens of aircraft, including some of the most modern fighters just delivered from France and the Soviet Union. 2 bombers meant for long-range strikes, Su-20s intended for battlefield support, and MiG-23s primed for air superiority. All gone. H-3 had functioned not only as a sanctuary, but as a logistical hub, servicing and supplying other Iraqi bases. Now, with its infrastructure incinerated, Iraq's western air corridor had effectively collapsed. But perhaps more troubling for Saddam than the material losses was the psychological impact. The illusion of invulnerability had been shattered. The West and the Arab allies who had backed Iraq with weapons and logistics were stunned. Intelligence agencies scrambled to assess what had gone wrong. How had Iran, a nation supposedly crippled by embargoes, bereft of foreign support, and embroiled in post-revolution chaos, managed to execute a strike that rivaled NATO's best air doctrine? Reports from Western attachés stationed in Jordan confirmed the impossible. Their own radar technicians had seen the Phantoms flying low but assumed they were friendly Iraqi patrols. The deception had been perfect. Iran hadn't just pulled off a strike, it had outwitted the collective eyes of multiple nations. In Tehran, the reaction couldn't have been more different. News of the mission spread like wildfire, first through military channels, then whispered in bazaars, and finally broadcast with pride over the radio. Despite government censorship and wartime secrecy, the essence of the story broke through. Iranian pilots had flown across enemy lines, destroyed dozens of Iraqi aircraft, and returned without a single loss. The people were euphoric. Morale, long suppressed by the grinding weight of war and the fear of invasion, surged. The Islamic Republic, long struggling to prove it could survive without the West, now had its proof in the skies. Crowds gathered outside air bases just to catch a glimpse of the returning Phantoms. Children traced their shapes in the sky. In homes and mosques across the country, prayers of thanks were offered, not just for the success of the mission, but for the survival of the brave men who had carried it out. Military strategists across the globe took note. The H-3 raid became a case study in asymmetric air power, proof that with the right tactics, even a technologically isolated nation could strike deep into an enemy's heartland. It highlighted the effectiveness of strategic depth penetration, the power of ultra-low-level flight to evade radar, and the critical role of precise refueling under combat conditions. The raid was now etched into the playbooks of air forces from India to Israel. War colleges studied it. Tactical air commanders revised their doctrines in its wake. Not since Operation Bolo during the Vietnam War had an airstrike combined such audacity with such devastating effectiveness. Pilots behind the mission. Behind every mission of legend are the men who risked everything to make it happen. The H-3 raid was no exception. These were not reckless daredevils. They were disciplined professionals, forged in the crucible of revolution and war, flying outdated aircraft with dwindling spare parts, yet executing one of the most precise air assaults in modern history. At the forefront was Colonel Farzad Afshar, the commanding officer of the strike force. A quiet and methodical man, Afshar had been trained in the United States under the Shah's regime and had logged thousands of hours in the F-4 Phantom. But nothing in his previous experience matched the complexity of this mission. As the lead pilot, he not only flew the first wave but was responsible for holding the entire formation together across hundreds of miles of hostile skies. Major Sayed Jalal Zand, an operations tactician with a reputation for daring plans, was instrumental in coordinating the timing and flight paths for the 3 separate H-3 targets. He anticipated radar blind spots, mapped refueling corridors with eerie precision, and helped design the diversionary feints flown by support aircraft that drew Iraqi eyes eastward while the Phantoms swept in from the west. Then there was Major Abbas Doran, perhaps the most charismatic and well-known Iranian fighter pilot of the war. Doran had already earned a name for himself with his high-risk air support missions near Khorramshahr and Avaz. His role in the H-3 strike, flying deep escort and suppressing potential Iraqi interceptors, was crucial to ensuring the strike group had a clean exit. But heroes aren't only found in the cockpits of bomb-laden Phantoms. The refueling crews, flying modified Boeing 707 and 747 tankers, performed aerial ballet with nerves of steel. Flying large, lumbering aircraft near the edge of contested airspace, they delivered life, sustaining fuel with pinpoint precision. The slightest miscalculation in fuel flow, turbulence, or timing could have led to disaster. Their performance ensured the mission didn't end in scattered crash sites across the desert. These men became icons in Iran's military lore. Some, like Doran, would not survive the war. He was later killed during a separate mission in 1982, refusing to eject until his crippled plane was well away from civilian areas, a final act of defiance and duty. Others faded into retirement, their roles known only to comrades and historians. But for one moment, on that April morning in 1981, they were giants, titans in the sky. Their names would be whispered with pride for generations, not just as warriors, but as symbols of defiance, proof that when faced with impossible odds, even the hunted can become the hunters. And even the smallest air force, if armed with courage, precision, and resolve, can send shockwaves across the world. The audacious Iranian airstrike on the H-3 airbase in April 1981 left more than just a trail of destroyed aircraft and burning tarmac. It left behind a set of timeless lessons etched into the doctrine of modern warfare. It demonstrated that air power, in its most effective form, is not simply about how many jets a nation possesses or how advanced its weapons systems are. It is about how creatively, decisively, and intelligently those assets are used. Perhaps the most crucial takeaway from the operation was this: air power is as much about brains as it is about bombs. In the case of H-3, the Iranian Air Force was outnumbered, under-resourced, and isolated from the global supply chain. Their F-4 Phantoms were aging, maintenance was a constant struggle, and spare parts had to be scavenged or reverse-engineered due to embargoes imposed after the 1979 revolution. Yet, what they lacked in material, they made up for in ingenuity, planning, and sheer willpower. The strike planners didn't just think tactically, they thought like chess players, 5 moves ahead, calculating every variable: fuel, radar coverage, refueling windows, enemy positioning, and most importantly, surprise. It was this strategic creativity that allowed Iran to do what even technologically superior forces might hesitate to attempt. They turned geography from a constraint into a weapon. Iraq had placed its most valuable aircraft at H-3 because it was considered untouchable, nestled deep within the country's western desert, nearly 1,000 kilometers from the Iranian border and protected by distance, radar, and presumed air superiority. But as the H-3 strike proved, geography does not guarantee safety. In fact, geography can give a false sense of invulnerability, lulling commanders into complacency. Iraq believed H-3 was beyond the reach of Iranian jets, and in a conventional sense, they were right. The distance was too great for a one-way mission, unless mid-air refueling was involved. And even then, there were challenges. How to sneak the refueling aircraft close enough without being detected. How to ensure the fighters wouldn't be intercepted by Iraqi air patrols. How to coordinate simultaneous attacks on multiple targets spread across a vast base complex. And yet, the Iranians managed it all. Their low-level flying tactics allowed them to stay under the radar. Their planning ensured that refueling happened right on schedule, and their timing, deception, and coordination enabled them to hit H-3 with surgical precision. This is where the next lesson emerges with clarity. Tactical surprise and deception can overcome technological disadvantage. Iran didn't just bomb a target. They executed a complex multi-stage operation under extreme conditions and did so flawlessly. From launch to impact to extraction, not a single Iranian jet was lost. Dozens of Iraqi aircraft, many of them cutting-edge and newly delivered, were destroyed on the ground before they ever had a chance to fight. Iraq's Air Force, believed to be one of the most formidable in the Middle East at the time, suffered a devastating psychological and strategic blow. This forced Iraqi commanders, and indeed their allies, to reassess the true balance of power. For Iraq, it was more than just an operational failure. It was a wake-up call, a painful reminder that hardware and confidence mean nothing if not backed by proper planning, vigilance, and readiness. For Iran, on the other hand, the H-3 strike became a moment of national pride, a beacon of hope in an otherwise grueling and bloody war. Within Iran, the mission was elevated to near mythical status. Newspapers hailed it as divine justice. Military academies began studying it as a model of asymmetric strategy. The men who flew the mission became household names and heroes to a generation growing up under siege. More importantly, the raid sent a clear signal to the outside world. Iran might be isolated and outgunned, but it was far from defenseless. Even decades later, the legacy of H-3 continues to echo through the halls of military academies and war colleges around the world. It is studied as an example of long-range strike capability under extreme constraint. It has been dissected in military journals, documentaries, and internal strategic briefings. Why? Because it's not just a story of aircraft hitting a target, it's a story about the power of human ingenuity, the ability to adapt and overcome, and the eternal truth that determination often trumps brute strength. The brilliance of the H-3 operation also lies in its timing. Iran was facing overwhelming odds at that point in the war. It was losing ground, international support was minimal, and morale was fragile. Yet, through bold action, it managed to not only stem the tide of Iraqi aggression, but to project power deep into enemy territory. This was no small feat. It rebalanced the psychological dynamics of the conflict, forcing Iraq to divert resources toward air-based security and defensive restructuring, time, energy, and effort that could have been spent on the front lines. It also created strategic hesitation in Baghdad. If Iran could strike H-3, what else could they hit? Where else might they appear next? How vulnerable were other safe Iraqi targets? That psychological pressure, that fear of the unknown, is a force multiplier in any war. It was a master stroke of psychological warfare, just as much as it was a tactical victory. And so, in retrospect, the Iranian airstrike on H-3 was more than just a successful military operation. It was a masterpiece. A rare blend of audacity, precision, discipline, and courage. It defied conventional wisdom, broke through presumed limits, and delivered a message that still resonates. You may surround us, sanction us, and underestimate us, but we still have teeth, and we know how to bite. That message is what elevates the H-3 raid from just another wartime engagement into the realm of legend. It's why it is remembered not only by those who lived through it, but by historians, pilots, and strategists alike. In the vast skies of military history, there are many dogfights, many bombings, many missions. But every so often, there is one that rises above the rest, not just because of its destruction, but because of what it meant. H-3 was that kind of mission. A whisper to the world that intelligence, courage, and resolve can overcome even the most daunting odds. And for every student of war, every young pilot learning to navigate the complexities of modern combat, the story of H-3 serves as a guiding light. A reminder that even when you're outnumbered, outspent, and outgunned, victory is still possible, if you're bold enough to chase it.